Let's talk about the idea of crossing the chasm, how people say yes to new things, and why adoption can be so difficult. First, just why do some products fail? There's a variety of reasons. Part of it can be customers don't see any benefits. The features that product has don't match what I desire. Maybe the company has overestimated the market. There's really not that many people that want this product. It could be that the product is poorly positioned. There's pricing problems. Maybe there's technical things that are at fault. That everything looked good in the lab, but all of a sudden when it's released, there's technical challenges. With some products, it's very poor timing. They just were released at the wrong time. Maybe we don't understand it from a promotional perspective, or perhaps there's insufficient distribution. In many cases, there's just a mismatch between what the company or the designer or the innovator thinks the market wants and what they don't. Do we really want bacon-flavored soda? Maybe there's an opportunity for a novelty, but not something that's going to scale up and sell millions and millions. Here's another funny example with Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin is trying to sell a swift kick in the butt for $1. And of course, Hobbes wants to know how business is doing, and it's terrible. He can hardly believe it. But again, Calvin thinks that everybody needs what I'm selling. And although that's kind of funny, no one would ever sell that. In fact, this happens quite a bit where inventors or innovators think they have what the world needs, but customers don't agree. So how does anything new get adopted? Well, there's this theory called the diffusion of innovation. And you may have heard of it. Oftentimes it's associated with the bell curve. It essentially describes how, why, and what rate new ideas, products, technologies, really anything spreads through cultures. And there's these categories of adoption. If you're on the front end, you're an innovator or an early adopter, that first 15%. Here's the early majority and then the late majority and the late mass. It might be helpful to just pause and think about, in what areas of my life or work am I or have I been an innovator, an adopter, an early majority, a late majority, or late mass? Maybe you would put yourself on the front end of adopting new phones, but on the late end for changing your music style. And so each of these categories can be really relevant when we think about new innovations. And so this is typically the original technology and innovation adoption cycle. We think, okay, if I release a new product here, there's going to be this initial 2.5% that they were already waiting for my product or my service. The early adopters are kind of watching them, and then we follow this nice curve. But what happens is that there is this thing called a chasm that falls in between these first two categories and the rest. The innovation chasm has been described by quite a few people. There's a book called Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore, but others like Malcolm Gladwell and Robert Cialdini and Everett Rogers have talked about the notion that there is this chasm here. If you look here, here's a variety of different ways it's been discussed. We'll primarily talk about this top layer, innovators, early adopters, early majority, and late mass. And the idea is that if I'm going to have success as an innovator, as a designer, I've got to figure out how to get past that first 15% of the market, because this is this zone where new products, new ideas, new services, new experiences, new brands go to die. And so I got to figure out, how do I get over that tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell would call it. So let's talk about one key theory for adoption. It's called prospect theory, and Kahneman and Tversky won the Nobel Prize for some of these ideas. And it's this idea that across multiple experiences and domains in life, losses loom larger than gains. We are more fearful, more avoidant of having a loss, say when I try that new thing and it doesn't turn out the way I thought it would, than we are excited about the gains. You can see how the scales of these two, this value function, is different. And part of this, it just reflects the status quo. People have a hard time giving up what they already have. And so new solutions have to be way better than the old solution. This is also referred to as the endowment effect. Once I have something in my possession, once it's my status quo, it's really difficult to give it up. There's also this idea of the developer's curse. So this is not just a problem that's created by the customer or the consumer. The developer or the designer or the marketer or the innovator, whoever that person or that team is that's coming up with the new product, they're also an outlier. They believe, like Calvin did in his example, in the benefit of the new product. They have years of experience. They're convinced this works. It's so much better. And yet the consumer is seeing it for the first time. They're completely unaware, they're unconvinced of this need, and they're skeptical. And so the consumer overweights the benefits of the status quo. This is that losses loom larger than gains, or described by prospect theory. And the developer is overweighting the benefits of the innovation. And so there's this clash of points, and it contributes to this idea of the chasm. And so the greater the required changes from the consumer, the greater the potential resistance. One example would be Webvan. In recent years, online grocery has really picked up. And yet Webvan introduced this idea way back in 1996. And they tried really, really hard for about 5 years. They invested over $1 billion. Really smart people. They, at their heyday, were up in up to 8 markets, in major markets. And yet it's in 2001, 2002, they essentially had to close their doors and call it a complete failure. It was too difficult to overcome the weight of the status quo, even though it made sense to people at the time who had come up with this idea. And so as we think about just this whole idea of how do things get adopted and why is it difficult, I might say to someone I'm talking with, hey, with anything new, it's hard to cross the chasm. There's that gap, right, between the first 15% of the market and the rest of the market. And then secondly, I might say, there's a lot of psychology behind consumer adoption. There's theories like prospect theory that help us understand, how hard it is and what we have to do to overcome it. So these are just a few ideas around crossing the chasm, reasons for product failure, and why it's so important to understand it.